Question 4 of paper 2 carries only 16 marks, which means you have 24 minutes to do it, including your reading time. Let's check out what you must do with the question itself. You will always be asked to write about the whole of both sources. So what is it we're going to have to write about? Here it's the different perspectives and the different feelings that the writers have about what? Their experiences at sea. So we're going to discount anything else from our answer. Okay, well, what's going to get us the marks? First, we're going to compare, and that just means saying why one writer is similar or different to the other writer. And then to get the extra marks, we're always going to think about the writer's methods. So there are massive advantages of focusing just on VARs. The first advantage is that you don't have to think about dozens of techniques. The second massive advantage is that these techniques always come up 100% of the time. So if you only write about these, you will be 100% safe in every single exam. My technique is simply going to be to read the text and then write about anything that answers the question. There is one tactic I need to be aware of, and that is I need to write about the beginning and the middle and the end, because that's the only way to prove to the examiner that I'm writing about the whole of both sources. Now, this exam paper and everything in it is freely available on the AQA website. And we are diving into paper 2, Viewpoints and Perspectives from June 2019. You should always read the context in the box, because that will often help you work out important information about the context. In 2005, Ben Fogle and James Cracknell set off together in a 7-week race across the Atlantic Ocean in a rowing boat called Spirit. In their book, The Crossing, Ben describes what happened one night as he rowed and James slept. It was still dark. We had at least 3 hours of darkness to go before daybreak, and as always, I had the sunrise shift. The ocean had continued to build with an ever-increasing wind that was gusting at 40 knots. The swell had grown, and conditions were becoming increasingly frenzied. I began to feel vulnerable again. If we can just make it to daybreak, I thought, it will be easier to read the waves and prepare for the breakers. Okay, I know I'm going to pick something from the beginning, and I have some emotive language. We've got this detail of the wind becoming frenzied, which suggests that they might be in danger, and that's backed up by this use of the adjective vulnerable. Then we have the use of just to make it look unlikely that he'll actually survive. Ben Fogle tries to convey the danger that the sea poses, full stop. He begins with the emotive adjective frenzied to describe the wind, comma, which hints at the danger of extreme weather, full stop. He builds on this with the adjective vulnerable to contrast his weakness with the power of the sea, full stop. So in yellow I've highlighted my methods. I know I'm already scoring really high marks, and you'll notice that my quotations are embedded into my sentences. So we jump into our next paragraph. Our boat was brand spanking new and bought straight from the race organisers. It had coped with the seas we had experienced thus far incredibly well. I rode on, worried by the deteriorating weather. Well, there we have the emotive language again, but it's not a new technique, so I'm not going to mention it. And I thought of my wife back at home. I longed to be with her and away from this intimidating ocean. Again, lots of emotive adjectives, but we've had those, so I'm not going to mention them. As I rode, a barely perceptible blue hue appeared on the skyline. And we've even got a rhyme here with blue and hue, which is drawn out. I could write very intelligently about that, but it's not part of my vase. The other reason I'm not going to bother is that we could say this is also from the beginning of the passage, and we need something from the middle and the end. So tactically, I'm just going to concentrate on those. The swell was gathering, and the breaking waves were becoming more frequent. Come on, son, I thought, willing the day to break. Something wasn't right. Well, we've got a really short sentence here, which is a technique that I could mention, but it's not in vase, so I'm not going to bother. Why not, Mr. Salles? Why are you passing up these opportunities? Because I know the examiner has chosen something that will be full of that figurative language, the similes, the metaphors, the personification. Let's find them. Let's win those marks. I watched as a vast wave gathered behind the boat, soaring above the cabin, a wall of white water towering over our tiny boat. Boom, there she is. Alliteration, towering, tiny. The metaphor of the wall of white water, and more alliteration with the white and water. Wherein it's a double, triple whammy with 2 lots of alliteration, 1 metaphor. Can't fail. Fogel further emphasises the danger therein with a combination of metaphor and alliteration. Full stop. The waves have become a wall of white water, which appears both powerful and destructive. It appears to be an obstacle they cannot pass. Full stop. The danger is further emphasised through alliteration in white water, and then the contrast of the water towering over the tiny boat in a further example of alliteration. So here again I've highlighted in yellow the methods, so I know I'm going to be scoring the marks. Well, there's bound to be more drama. Let's read on. Once again I dug the oars in to propel us forward, but the wave was too big. For a moment it felt like we were moving backwards as we were sucked into the belly of the wave. Another metaphor. The horizon disappearing as the churning surf enveloped the stern of the boat. I felt it lift as a torrent of water crashed over the boat. Well, you're picking up all the emotive language here. And I felt myself falling backwards. I was aware of the boat collapsing on top of me. I struggled to pull my feet from the stirrups to no avail. The world went black. There's that short sentence to emphasise the danger again. I felt a weight on top of me, and then a rush of cold water as my body was brutally submerged into the bottomless Atlantic Ocean. More emotive language everywhere. My feet were sucked from my shoes as I clung onto the oars for dear life, but then they too were dragged from my clasp. More emotive language with the verb dragged and sucked. My mind went blank. Oh dear, what a boring metaphor that one is. As I tumbled through the surf, spun around roughly like clothes in a washing machine. Cliché upon cliché. Well, Ben, you're not a writer, but it doesn't matter. You've whapped the simile with some sibilance, the surf which spun. So boom, we're in again, a double whammy, 2 techniques in 1 quotation. Next, he tells us that they were actually capsized and describes the danger he was in through simile and sibilance. He uses the verbs tumbled and spun because we already associate these with a washing machine. This simile helps because every reader will be familiar with the action of a washing machine. There's also an element of irony because a washing machine keeps everything in one place. This is contrasted with the real danger that Ben himself might get detached from his rowing boat in the middle of the Atlantic, and therefore drown. The image of being trapped within a washing machine also helps us imagine what drowning would feel like. Again, you can see my paragraph is full of methods, simile, sibilance, verbs, and the bonus ones of irony and contrast. Now remember, you don't need irony and contrast because they aren't in vase. Remember, the advantage of vase is just so that you know these things will always appear no matter what the question. If you spot other techniques, well, mention them, why not? Now it is important to remember that I am dictating my answer here, and so it was easy for me to get to 221 words, but you might not be able to reproduce that under exam conditions writing by hand within the time limit you've got. So this section on irony and contrast you wouldn't even have to put in at all if you didn't want to, and that gives us time to write something about the ending. Now the advantage of this being an exam is that you know the ending will have been chosen by the examiner for a reason. In other words, that ending will always show a change of perspective. So I'm just going to ignore the rest of the passage and just go to where I know that change of perspective is. By the way, I'm assuming you've read the rest of the passage, but I'm going to comment on this bit at the end. So what's happened in the rest of the passage is that Ben has righted himself, got to the surface, found the capsized boat, and he's also found his partner in this expedition, James. All around us, the ocean was strewn with debris, loose equipment from the deck. After 5 weeks at sea, we had become complacent and had long stopped lashing things down. We could only watch as all our worldly possessions drifted away into the rolling ocean. So I've got some techniques here. I've got the emotive language of we could only watch. I love it because it also has the alliteration of the W of we and watch, which emphasizes his powerlessness. And he also now blames himself rather than the power of the ocean. And that's emphasized through sibilants, the S sounds in weeks at sea, complacent, stopped lashing. So the sibilants emphasizes his own and James's own responsibility or irresponsibility in their behaviour. Fogel ends the description by blaming himself for his own disaster, rather than nature. To do this, he uses emotive language and sibilants. After weeks at sea, they had become complacent and stopped lashing their belongings, which emphasizes their irresponsibility. The consequence of this is dramatized through the alliteration of W in we could only watch as their worldly possessions floated away from them. Hopefully you've spotted that I'm naming the methods as I go and also using those embedded quotations fitting into my sentences so that they make sense. Now we turn to source B, and I always do source B second because it's the older text and therefore potentially harder for you to understand in the exam. The other advantage is I don't have to write quite as much about source B as long as I get one thing from the beginning, one from the middle, one from the end. So, in 1893, William Hudson travelled by sea to Patagonia, a remote area in South America, to study birds. In his book, Idle Days in Patagonia, he describes the journey to get there. The wind had blown a gale all night, and I had been hourly expecting that the tumbling, storm-shaken old steamship, which I had taken passage to Patagonia, would turn over once and for all, and settle down beneath the tremulous tumult of waters. He loves a bit of alliteration, doesn't he? For the groaning sound of its straining timbers and the engine throbbing like an overworked human heart had made the ship seem like a living thing to me, and it was tired of the struggle, and under the tumult was peace. But at about 3 o'clock in the morning the wind began to drop, and taking off coat and boots, I threw myself in my bunk for a little sleep. So I can make a comparison here. The alliteration is used to dramatise danger again, but in this instance the danger is not real, and it's not from nature, it's from the age of the boat, which we also get through the idea of it being human. Hey, personification, we haven't had that before. The boat has a human heart. And in case you didn't realise, this is a simile, and a simile can be personification. It's not just metaphor. In text B, Hudson also uses alliteration to emphasise the danger he is in. However, the danger is from a storm which has already passed, described as a tremendous tumult of water. The adjective tremendous also helps us imagine the extreme power of the storm, just like Fogel's fear of the waves. Next, he uses personification to convey the age and weakness or fragility of the ship, with the simile of the engine throbbing like an overused human heart. We could argue this is also a comic description, which prevents us from feeling truly afraid for Hudson's safety, unlike Fogel, who was seriously at risk of death. What's new in this paragraph? Well, everything highlighted in green is where I'm showing the examiner that I'm making a comparison between the two writers of the two texts. So tactically, I now want to go to the middle of the text. This paragraph is still probably the beginning. It does have quite a few techniques in it which I could write about, but that's not going to be me answering the whole text. So I'm going to leap ahead to these two paragraphs, which are the middle. And then I'll have the final two paragraphs, which will be the end. I was just dropping into a doze when a succession of bumps, accompanied by a strange grating and grinding noises and shuddering motions of the ship, caused me to start up again and rush to the cabin door. So I now have the alliteration of grating and grinding and the sibilance of shuddering and rush and start and ship. Okay, why is that there? Well, again, it's to emphasise danger. The night was still black and starless, with wind and rain, but for acres round us the sea was whiter than milk. I did not step out, as close to me, where our only lifeboat was fastened, 3 of the sailors were standing together, talking in low tones. "We are lost," I heard one say, and another answer, "Aye, lost forever." Just then the mate, roused from sleep, came running to them. "What have you done?" he exclaimed sharply. Then, dropping his voice, he added, "Lower the lifeboat, quick!" More alliteration there to give us the idea of panic. We're in. Let's just see if there's anything else in this paragraph that we should mention instead. I crept out and stood unseen by them in the dark. Not a thought of the wicked act that they were about to engage in entered my mind at the time, for it was their intention to save themselves and leave us to our fate in that awful white surf. My only thought was that at the last moment I would spring with them into the boat and save myself. So there's a massive contrast to Ben Fogle, who was desperate to save James, isn't there? But one other person more experienced than myself, and whose courage took a better form, was also near and listening. He was the first engineer. Seeing the men making for the lifeboat, he slipped out of the engine room, revolver in hand, and secretly followed them. And when the mate gave the order to board, he stepped forward with the weapon raised and said, in a quiet but determined voice, that he would shoot the first man who should attempt to obey it. The men slunk away and disappeared in the gloom. Well, I love it, but it's not full of the same techniques. So I ain't gonna use it. I haven't got time. Next, Hudson introduces us to new danger as the boat runs aground against the rocks. The alliteration of grating and grinding reminds us that the boat could sink at any time. Like Fogle, he also uses sibilance, with the shuddering motions of the ship, which caused him to rush for safety. This whole description is just as emotive as Fogle's, but it is also accompanied by a sense of shame that his reaction was not to save any other passengers on the ship, only himself. Again, notice how I'm naming the methods, those are in yellow, but all the time, because this is the second text, I'm having to compare backwards, and the comparison words are here in green. Now, tactically, we're going to go to the end, and remember how Fogle blamed himself. We're now going to see if Hudson also blames himself or has another point of view. In a few moments more, the passengers began streaming out onto the deck in a great state of alarm. Last of all, the old captain, white and hollow-eyed, appeared like a ghost among us. We had not been standing there long when, by some freak chance, the steamship got off the rocks and plunged on through the seething, milky surf. Then, very suddenly, passed out of it into black and comparatively calm water. For 10 minutes she sped rapidly and smoothly on. Then it was said that we were stuck fast in the sand of the shore, although no shore was visible in the darkness. So I've got plenty of sibilance here to show that they are in a new danger. So I could write about that, but it doesn't get me to that ending where I want to write about whether he blames himself or not, whether he's different to Fogel. There was no longer any wind, but through the fast breaking clouds ahead of us appeared the first welcome signs of dawn. It was true enough that we were stuck fast in the sand, but although this was a safer bed for the steamship than the jagged rocks, our position was still a perilous one, and I at once determined to land. So here he's still thinking about saving himself, which is fair enough, but slightly different from Ben Fogel, and he conveys the danger still through the sibilants of stuck fast in sand and safer for the steamship, and the position was still perilous. Unlike Fogel, who was desperate to save his friend James at the end of text A, Hudson is still only concerned with saving himself. His life is contrasted with that of the captain, who is described with the simile as like a ghost. In his mind, Hudson is already thinking about the ship and its captain as dead, full stop. Describing how the ship was stuck fast in the sand. This recreates the softness of the sand, but also emphasizes the sinister possibility that they are stuck at sea and will drown. He uses sibilants to show that this is still safer for the steamship, but then marries this with alliteration to convey his desperation to escape, because our position was still a perilous one. Again, you can see that the methods are highlighted in yellow, the comparisons in green, and a little tip here, when you want to reduce the number of words in a quotation, stick in an ellipsis. And a top tip when you're writing about sibilants, it's only ever really used for two purposes. One, to create an idea of peace, which I've got here with the idea of softness, or to be sinister and dangerous. So you know as soon as you spot any sibilants, it's going to be one of those two purposes. Now let's go over to the mark scheme and see what the examiner's views are. Mark schemes can look intimidating, but I really encourage you to use them because they give you so many top tips. So first, they want us to know that this is not a model answer and it's not a complete response. So has our answer been detailed? Yes, it has. Does it compare ideas? Well, we looked at all those words highlighted in green. And is it perceptive? Well, we can decide that by looking at the range of analysis. Does it have a lot of analysis in it? Yes, it does, because we've mentioned loads of methods. Do we have judicious supporting textual detail? Yes, we do. We have those embedded quotations. Does it have different perspectives? Yes, because we've shown that there's a difference between the two writers. Now, if we want some more help, we can come over to this third column, and when you read through it, I suggest you read the screen if you want to, you'll find that there aren't any techniques in there that weren't in VARs, except for one. The examiner has spotted some onomatopoeia. Now remember, I said if you spot a technique that's not in VARs, well, write about it, why not? Although in this instance I would argue that the word throbbing isn't necessarily onomatopoeic there. I think the examiner's reaching. That's really encouraging for you though, because it means that if you're making a point that isn't 100% certain, you'll probably be given the benefit of the doubt. The only thing that is in here that I haven't used myself is the word tone. So note to self, see if I can include that in my future answers. And when we look at this, we see there's nothing in here that isn't already in VARs. So I know that method is absolutely going to work for me, no matter what the question. Now this question 4 was only worth 16 marks. Question 4 on paper 1 is worth 24 marks. So that is the video you should be studying next. It's coming up now. Check it out. See you soon on my channel.